Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to our first discussion, Nation in Conversation. I've got a very strong panel with me today. Firstly, Dr. Simba Makoni, a Zimbabwean politician, but also a farmer. And then, of course, Chris Venter, CEO Africa Group. And next to him, Rafael Kuraui from the JSE, some farming experience and Namibian background, and then Russell Dupree. You wanted to be referred to as an entrepreneur in general. Great to have you all here. The discussion we're going to have today is going to deal with two very important issues. The one is the whole issue of policy uncertainty, policy and agriculture. What are the good news? What are the bad news? Why is policy so important? We know that policy in general are political decisions converted through a process to eventually become something that must be implemented to provide a kind of a playing field. What is it that doesn't work and what is it that works? So first we will discuss that, and then towards the end of our program we'll move into the scenario themes. What are the good news? What are the bad news? Where are we going? Where are not going? And I'm already told my partner from Zimbabwe, we're going to ask him how the Zimbabwe scenario is going to look, because that's the one thing that we discuss quite often in South Africa. So let's start off firstly, Simba, policy. Why is policy so important in agriculture?
Policy is very important, not just in agriculture, but in all walks of life, because policy defines the field of play. It defines the parameters that govern your actions. It also guides you in how you conduct your business, your game, if it's a game. Everything we do is conducted in terms of a policy framework. That's why it is important. It's the landmark. It's what tells us where to go, how to go there, at what speed to go there.
Chris, can I ask you, you're in agribusiness. What is it that bothers you in the enterprise you're in the business you're in, about policy and agriculture? What are the missing links?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem that we have is obviously making sure our customers are comfortable. And I think that in an environment where policy is not certain, an environment where your customer base feels uncertain of investing for the future, that creates concern. So we need to find a way in the South African environment to create policy certainty for the customers, for the farmers primarily, so that they must feel comfortable to spend that additional amount to create a new piece of land or to plant on a new piece of land and buy the inputs, buy the technology. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge that we have today.
But we've heard the politicians saying so often, when we accuse them of policy uncertainty, they ask us this rhetorical question, but what is uncertain? What is uncertain about uncertainty?
Well, I think the reality of the current environment is there's a huge debate going on nationally on land reform. That is uncertain. The environment must be such that any individual must feel comfortable to grow and invest in himself so that he can grow. So if you tell any business, whether it's an agribusiness or whether it's a bank or whether it's a farmer, that he can only have a certain limitation on his growth, then you doesn't necessarily create that appetite for investment. So that's an uncertainty. If there are any debates around land ceiling or ownership ceilings in terms of size of farms, that create uncertainty. If there's a debate whether I should have 50% of my farm being transferred or have parties invest in that, that's uncertainty. A lot of BE codes were created for business. And we were advised that if we can, if we have 26% black owned in our business, ownership in our business, that will give us a certain amount of BE points. Now that certainty is obviously what I think a farmer needs. And as long as you don't have that, then your customer base doesn't necessarily feel certain. So yes, there are certainty in terms of what is currently there, but there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of challenging that status quo by various parties in terms of what it should be.
Thanks. Rafael, can I ask you this difficult question about ideology and policy? it seems to me, if I look at the policy world around me, I'm not exactly sure whether policy is driven by ideology or is it driven by the reality on the ground? Is it that the politicians would like to change the world the way they think it should be, or are they listening to the guys on the ground? Where's the magic?
Thanks, Theo. I think really maybe to try and attempt to answer the difficult question is to say, in fact, a hybrid of both the worlds would be the ideal spot to be at. In other words, the politicians they are developing the rules of engagement, but one wouldn't like to see that happening in vacuum. So, in other words, you really have to try to understand the needs of the farmer on the ground. He has been farming for the past 100 years around here on the South African soil. So I think a combination of acknowledging the fact that there are certain issues we need to redress, such as land reform, but at the same time trying to really see what is the best in terms of addressing this without really rocking the boat and seeing that it's a win-win for all citizens in the country.
Russell, the paradigm you're in is a rugby paradigm. That's your policy paradigm. Now government asks you to play soccer on the rugby field, and you must do an investment. How do you deal with that almost ambiguity of a certain situation that you can see it's working, you know how it's working, and then this new issue, the new rules that they're putting on the game? Are you going to change the size of the field? Are you going to change the design of the poles? What are you going to do?
Loaded question. I mean, I think you set me up on this one. I do think that we need to start at the beginning. Capitalism is a way that you believe tomorrow will be better than today. So it's about the allocation of capital. So if you want to invest in one asset, you're going to make a quick decision and the money will flow to that side. So there's a few things that we know about human nature. First of all, we're all in our self-interest. Okay, it's nature. So if you're not incentivized to do something, you won't do it, good or bad. And that is a common goal. If you go back to Plato and Aristotle, that has already been there. So if we don't know what's the rules of the game, how do you play the game? So sometimes, like you said, people want to play rugby with soccer rules, and then it's a little bit of a problem with offsides. The one problem we have, and that is that money can flow like water, and capital can flow like water. We have the opportunity to invest in different countries. I mean, we deployed money in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia. I mean, Chris, you've all over, in Uganda and so forth. So it took us close to a year to open a company in Mozambique. I mean, does that make sense? That doesn't make it easy. I mean, the rules in Mozambique, for instance, on just land, do you own the land? Can you put the capital down? That creates a problem. And another big question is, if you look at the world, the total GDP of the world is $75 trillion. Europe, Canada, and the EU is $35 trillion with 840 million people. I mean, why do you have all this wealth concentrated there? So obviously the rules of the game in that countries are very secure. And you go back, if you go and buy a piece of land in America, you have no doubt on what's the rules of the game. So if we go and buy a piece of land or try to get a piece of land in Mozambique, or now we're creating a little bit of a confusion in South Africa, I mean, do we really want that uncertainty? You need foreign direct investments. How do you make it easy for people to deploy money in a certain place? And I mean, we can go on and on this issue, but I mean, make it easy for people to deploy their money so that they can get a return and that they can deploy more money for the future.
Can I ask you, Simba, in a very dynamic policy environment, in other words, you have certain policies, the policies change, and there must be some form of adaptation or getting to know the game rules for a moment, if we use policy as a set of game rules. whose responsibility is it to understand those game rules? Are you waiting for government to tell you, or are you from the farming community going to investigate, do research? Where would you place that responsibility?
I don't think you can fix it rigidly in one center or one constituency. The cliche goes, change is the only constant. So we're always changing. And as we change, even if the policy framework remains the same, the implementation matrix might change. So whose responsibility is it? It is our collective responsibility. There's a portion of government responsibility, there's a portion of business responsibility, there's a portion of society responsibility. In this ever-changing matrix, we all need to change with it. Or even more importantly, we need to change it. And each one of us, the major stakeholders in current language, would have a role to play in influencing the pace and the direction of the change.
Now, 10 or 15 years ago, we had a radical land reform exercise in Zimbabwe. That was, that is a totally new way of doing things. What was the process of farmers adapting to it? Can you share something with us about how do you deal with this very radical situation that took place there?
Yeah, the first point to make is just to correct the language. We didn't have land reform in Zimbabwe. We had land acquisition and redistribution. We acquired land and parceled it out. But there was hardly any reform in the utilization and deployment of the land. And I think it's important for South Africans particularly to accept that the key challenge about reform, agrarian reform I'd like to call it, not land reform, is not just acquiring and parceling out. It's what you do with it after you've acquired and parceled it out. But the answer to your question is, again, to be a little bit more proactive, preemptive of the next part of the session, don't react. Many players in Zimbabwe involved in land and agriculture were caught unawares by the occupation of land. And both government and farmers reacted to the invaders, as they were called. Nobody planned for it. And in a discussion around policy and planning, it is important for us to be proactive so as we can shape the direction of the policy and the activities emanating from that policy. Many people reacted in panic. Certainly farmers whose farms were invaded or acquired reacted in panic. And when you react in panic, you react negatively and not positively. And that became the hallmark of the land reform exercise in Zimbabwe. Panic, negative reactions, rather than proactive, positive actions.
Can we move a little bit further on the proactiveness of policy? How would you see the farming community in general interacting with government on doing that? Is it maintaining a high level of constructive engagement? Is it doing your own thing? How would you take that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think the process that the president has kicked off is actually it's a must-have in South Africa, to be quite honest. I think there's a complete, in certain areas, there's a misunderstanding in terms of what the process really is, because I do find people thinking that the land reform and expropriation without compensation is already happening. But I think it's clear to understand that there's a process going on at this point in time which allows people to engage with government in terms of that potential expropriation process. And the more we engage, the better for everybody around the table. I think it's important for farmers, big and small farmers, to engage in that process. We can't get away from the idea of not looking at land reform in South Africa. And as we sit in more and more of these engagement meetings, you realize that the process and the land reform is so complex, because it's not necessarily just taking from the one to give to the other. It's also a process of understanding a small farmer or a small household in Nampo not having a title deed to his house. You know, it's also understanding that the concept, if you grow up not having that title deed, how are you increasing your wealth over a period, which was said in one of the previous discussions. And I just think that we need to engage from all areas. I think we need to provide certainty at the end of this process. So hopefully government will get at the point where they address title deeds, where they address communal land, where they address land owned by trust, where they address the farmland, and provide that certainty so that each individual who wants to farm has the ability to actually grow wealth on a piece of land that he can truly own, and there's a process and a legal process that protect that ownership.
Raphael, would you like to share with us a bit about the Namibian experience about land reform and policy development? We take note of it. It happened differently, but is it so different from what's currently happening in South Africa, or so vastly different from what happened in Zimbabwe? How would you typify the Namibian experience?
Thanks, Theo. Let me perhaps just start by underscoring what the two previous speakers have just said about the fact that land expropriation in South Africa, I think it's something that we need to see as a reality. But it's a question of how we react to that reality, and I think it's a very important statement that has been said there. Now, in the Namibian situation, of course, Namibia got its independence from South Africa about in 1990, which is 27 years ago now. And of course, because of that symbiotic relationship between the two countries, we have a lot in common. We share a lot in common. But at the dawn of democracy in Namibia, the government adopted a policy of a willing seller, willing buyer on the land issue. So it went like that for quite a while. But then immediately, of course, after a couple of years, they realized that, in fact, a large portion of land still remained in the hands of the previous owners. And so then they realized it's not going to move. So then they instituted another new law or guidance or policy, which they called where they gave the government the first right of refusal. So in other words, if there is a farm on offer, a farm for sale, the commercial farms particularly, for sale in Namibia, the government would be the first buyer. And unless they then give clearance that they are not willing to buy that particular farm, then it can go to the open market. That went quite well, and I think it's still the one that is currently in place, except for what we alluded to earlier again, that there has been quite a significant shift of land to the historically disadvantaged. The unfortunate thing being that those who were given that portion of land, which was a commercially viable land, some were exporting either beef or tulips to Europe, are currently now actually non-functional. So the land was transferred, what then? And I think really, unless we address that next phase, it becomes a futile exercise. Of late, the Namibian government also was now in a financial squeeze, to the point that they decided they are not now going to buy any additional farms for redistribution. But and we thought, when the government pulls out of this, actually the prices of the farm prices are going to go down. But actually, in essence, it didn't go down, because now all of a sudden we also have seen a wave of South African farmers who are buying a lot of farms in Namibia. And that meant that the price of the farm actually remains still high, even though the government is not really active in that space anymore. So just that's where Namibia is at the moment.
Russell, can I throw this ball to you? Everybody here is saying it's not land reform that matters so much, but what do you do with the land once you've get it? I think, Simba, you mentioned it first. That is how do you unlock the potential of land in terms of capital and whatever in a situation that is primarily uncertain? How do you do it?
I mean, once again, we're trying to answer a question which has got so much layers on top of it. First of all, we're looking at debt capital. I mean, the biggest problem is, as soon as there's a transfer of money from land from one to other, you don't give title to the new owner, you make it debt capital. I mean, and that layer of can you get finance, can you get inputs, and so forth, that makes it so difficult. I mean, The land issue on, there's a good book on De Soto that wrote about this whole issue, and especially on township houses. Why don't you convert it to title? And all of a sudden you will see a lot of different movement on that. But that's besides the point. So you don't want to make live capital debt capital. You need that side of it. So out of an, yes?
Yes, I just want to underscore that statement that I just gave that example where the Namibian government was buying land and distributing to the people, but the title of that new land remained in the name of government. And then they gave a 99-year allocation or something like that. And all of a sudden, commercial land, which was viable, bought by government for redistribution, becomes useless. And just
you saved me on this one. So first of all, because the point is, what's the goal of society? So first of all, back in 1956, the Tomlinson report that Verwoerd asked that they wrote it, and he came back and said, we need to transfer land to the people in Transkei and all their homelands. And Verwoerd said, no, we can't trust the people to have their own land. And we want to make the same mistake again. I mean, ownership is so important for anybody. So do we want to just keep on making the constant same mistakes? No, we don't. So what's the goal? We want health, wealth, wholeness, and the whole thing for any of our society or the people in our society. So I really do think that you can't live without title, and we need to focus that the people, that's been wrong in the past. So there's no doubt that there's definitely been sins of our fathers, absolutely. How do we make it right? But for the long run, how do we gain the momentum that's already been created? So please, let's do the distribution, but keep the title. Give it to the people that used to own it then, and then the system can go on. Don't, we're here to solve the problem of poverty. And how do we do it? That should be the question. Not about who owns the land or not, as long as we can.
But can we take this discussion one level higher, that is Southern Africa? Because it seems to me, when we look at, let's say, policy reform or policy changes in Southern Africa, we are actually talking something differently, because if we look at our electricity grid, it's not a South African one, it's a subcontinental one. If the power drops in Cape Town, it influences Namibia or Zimbabwe or even Mozambique. If the dams of Mozambique don't work, Johannesburg feels it. It's a subcontinental grid, the same with water. How do you deal with agriculture in this southern African continent? Shouldn't we change the way we look at things, incorporating more than just South Africa?
Yes, I think the simple answer is agriculture is one, if not the most important integrator of our economies. If we act properly, if we formulate the right policies in each country and then connect them regionally. I'm aware that if this history is correct, as way back as 1939, there was an agricultural economics professor at Potch who saw the potential of tapping water from the Zambezi for the northern Transvaal. Now, that vision.
I missed that guy. I wasn't in Potch that time.
That vision is what informed what you've just referred to, what is now called the Southern African Power Pool, the integrated regional grid. It comes from Inga in the Congo down to Cape Town, from Tanzania into Malawi. Agriculture can achieve that for us very quickly, very effectively. And it can solve some of the resource differentials that we have between our various countries. But let me say a little footnote to the discussion we had just a moment ago. And words can invoke emotion, acquisition without compensation. I share a Zim experience. When our government changed the law from the entrenched clauses of the Lancaster House Constitution, which is what ushered our independence. And land acquisition was one of the areas that couldn't be touched for 10 years. One of the elements they brought into the new Land Acquisition Act was acquisition without compensation. And it generated a lot of emotion until people understood what government meant was we were not going to pay for land, but we were going to pay for the improvements on the land. And when you did the numbers of the irrigation systems, the barns for tobacco curing, and the pumps, the price of the land or the value of the land was insignificant. You could literally write it off before the depreciation. So we could get stuck on words and slogans which, if we unpack, are really not impediments to our going forward.
Chris, going into this Southern African environment, you ventured in there. What are the good news? What are the bad news?
How long time do I have? I think the issue is that you have primarily we come back to the policy issue. I mean, in all these countries you have different challenges. If I look at Zimbabwe specifically in the business that we have there, obviously currently there's a new regime, but we have historical issues there in terms of just movement of capital. So you want to continually invest, and I think the certainty that I raised earlier create that environment where you want investors to come in. Mozambique is different. There's a different environment in Mozambique. There's a different environment in Botswana and in South Africa. So the problem that you have is that we like to look at it as Southern Africa, but we sometimes forget that it's independent nations, independent legal systems, independent approaches in terms of capital and capital utilization. And then if you add the land issue to that in terms of certainty of ownership, then it's a whole new different environment in terms of which you need to operate in. So sometimes we enter into these environments of saying, you know, we know what we've done in South Africa, let's try it in Botswana or in Zimbabwe, it doesn't work. So you need to engage in that area, and it takes time to then do that. But from a process point of view, if we really want to say that Southern Africa needs to be a provider of food for the nations in future, you need to get almost to a planning process first to say, okay, what is it that we're going to need in 50 years? And how much food are we going to have to produce for our nations in 50 years? So that you can work back. It's almost like baking a cake without understanding exactly how the cake is going to look like. But you can't just use one of those ingredients, which is land, and then park it on the one side and say, well, we're going to treat this differently to the other parts of the ingredients, because then you end up in an environment where land means nothing. And then where does wealth come from if your fixed asset has no growth potential? And that is the difficulty and the potential risk that we sit with in South Africa, and we've seen it in neighboring countries. And then if there's no value to that land, your knock-on effects in terms of treating that land, in terms of allocation, becomes almost like a substandard process. And then it becomes more difficult to utilize land. We've been in Mozambique, we've been allocated, we've been invited to countries to actually have land available, thousands of hectares of land. But the difficulty in terms of operating it, in terms of ownership, in terms of 49 years or 99-year leases, is just so complex that nobody wants to do it. Which means that a huge, rich resource actually means nothing for that nation.
And how would something like the JSE look upon these things? Do they look at it in a larger sense? Do they only focus on, let's say, the policy and the business environment in South Africa, or are they playing already this bigger role?
We are indeed. And maybe let me start by saying, if we look at South Africa compared to the rest of the Southern African countries, we are a relatively very dry country. I think the national average rainfall is only about 450 millimeters. Compare that to Zambia, with probably an average rainfall of about 800-900 millimeters per annum. So yet South Africa is the breadbasket at the moment in terms of providing food to the rest of the subcontinent. And purely because we have really adapted very well, we have learned to do more with less. If you look at where the commercial farmers were 20 years ago and where they are now, we have probably gone down by 60% in the number of commercial farmers, yet we are producing at almost the same level, if not more, than where we were producing 20 years ago. So really we have to pat ourselves in the back as this commercial South African farmers in that respect. But where am I heading at here? At the JSE, we are the only institution that offers derivative instruments. These are now your futures and options which actually offer an opportunity for farmers to actually hedge the price risk. So in other words, you can lock in a price ahead of time. And these are instruments that I'm sure they have contributed to the vibrant of the grain industry here in South Africa. We identified this quite very early, and we started saying, is there any way we can roll this out to the rest of the continent, where we offer expertise which do not exist, and instead of those destinations to start from scratch, they can leverage on what we already have established here in South Africa. And our first port of call was Zambia. We have been working for a couple of years here to really now try and roll out these instruments which we offer in US dollars. And it was a first again for South Africa to be able to do that. We had to get special dispensation from the Reserve Bank to trade in a foreign currency for the Zambian market. The challenge is again getting back to the issue of policy. We sit here with a country where they end up distorting the free market by, say for example, they believe there's a shortfall of maize in a particular season. They would simply go and close borders between Malawi and Zambia, for example. And this creates a huge distortion in a free market. And those are some of the challenges, even as we are about to roll out these instruments into that country. Those are the challenges we are managing and talking to government to say, actually, when you have got these things, these hedging mechanisms, there's no need for you to panic and to run to close borders, except managing yourself and managing the...
Yeah, it's a form of managing food security.
Exactly.
That's really what you're doing. Russell, can we move to the last part, and that is looking a little bit forward? If you want to develop scenarios about where we're going, the first step is really to identify the key uncertainties. What are those issues?
I almost want to answer something on his statement about the weather. So what's the missing part? I mean, why is South Africa successful and those guys not food secure? So at a stage we did a index on food security against title deed, and it's a linear line. So the more secure your title deed, the higher your food security. So, I mean, actually all you need to do is give title deed to the people in Africa and they would be food secure. So, I mean, that is so the future for me is plain and simple. Take all the land in Africa and you make it from dead capital to live capital. You give the land to the people. You can even go as far as to say in Zimbabwe that no white man can have land, but only indigenous people. That's fine, but just give the title. Then you all of a sudden unlock this huge amount of capital to the balance sheet of that countries. I mean, Zambia is a good example on the farm blocks. So the future is unbelievable for Africa and South Africa if we do the right decisions. And it's all about value systems. I mean, any society's got basically 3 pillars it works on. Family or value system, law or trust and honesty, and the third one is property rights. It's been always like this. And if you take one of these pillars away, if you erode the value system of a society, you will find that this society will just fall away. So from our point of view, it's about allocation of capital, putting capital on a piece of land to build irrigation. So the future is bright if we make the right decisions. And I believe and pray really that our government will make the right decisions for the poor people. The people with capital can move. People without capital are trapped.
So what you are actually telling me is that one of the key uncertainties and one of the issues that we will have to get our heads around is our notion of property rights and where property sits in this whole thing.
Absolutely. I mean,
there's not only one way of doing it.
I mean, look at societies that failed over the past 2,000 years. Go to Venice and you will see that inclusiveness of people will make a successful society. Take that inclusiveness out, the whole economy will fail. Look at Rome. Look at China when they burned the ships. So it's about communication. Remember, Africa's got 2,000 languages of a total of 7,000. So why did Africa not develop like Europe? Why is Sweden more wealthy than Spain? Understand, there's three theories on that, and we can go into that. But the whole point is people choose not to develop. It's not about culture. It's about a choice. And we can have the choice here to really uplift the poorest of the poor by making the right policy decisions.
Would you add another key uncertainty to the future if we look at things? What are those things that, my definition of a key uncertainty is that if this thing changes, everything else changes?
Well, before I add the uncertainty, let me just piggyback on his observation. This process we're involved in is called nation in conversation. The starting point must be that this nation is genuinely and purposefully in conversation. I think you need to ask yourselves, it's a very good title. Are you really in conversation in this country? Are we in conversation in Zim? Are they in conversation in Namibia? We're in a situation where somebody sits there, they're called government, they know it all, and they will give to all of us what they believe is good for us. So I think the first step to remove the uncertainties of various kinds is for us to be genuinely engaged with each other, not just on land, but primarily on land and agriculture, because that is our forte. Secondly, and more importantly, is that what we agree on out of this conversation, we do and do effectively and timelessly. We can make a very good policy and sit on it. The result will not come. So the uncertainty that I would add to the others is, are we engaged together genuinely, honestly, and purposefully to a common good?
Very good point, and that is the discussion that takes place. Chris, what would you add to that issues that may change how the ball will eventually move, in what direction in the future? What are the issues that worry you?
Look, I think if you think about any successful farmer, you probably need the land, you need the capital, you need the infrastructure, you need skills, you need the free market. And I would imagine anything that goes around that in terms of policy decisions are obviously things that one needs to be careful about, that one needs to make sure you have. It's interesting that we say we want a huge market, and I've looked at the potential of Eastern Cape some time back, and we sit in an environment where in the Mpumalanga area we have lots of mines, so you have land available in Eastern Cape, and one needs to increase that opportunity there. But you then realize that the market's not necessarily there, and how are you going to deal with that? If we bring another 2 million hectares of land into production on the maize side, what will that do to the market? So you need to understand from a government point of view and from a policy point of view, have a planning process for 50 years, understand what you need, and then work back on those 5 elements of a successful farm. And when you work back on those five elements, not one of those you would want to put into a negative environment where no investment happens. So if we can assist the farmers in creating the certainty around land, creating certain infrastructure. Infrastructure is not there in terms of potential exports. So we need to make sure that it's there, but it's not there sufficiently. If you look at road transport, compared to rail transport. If you compare that then to the capital availability, how can you lend money to a small-scale farmer, 2-hectare farmer who doesn't necessarily have ownership of the land? So those are all issues that one needs to deal with. So coming back to Sima's point in terms of the whole process of investment and the whole process of understanding that conversation, one needs to maybe take that conversation into the other areas of those different parts as well.
I would like to drop a hot potato in your lap, and that is traditional leaders and the future. A large portion of South Africa and several of the other countries in Southern Africa has got traditional leaders on land that traditionally belong to them, where the ownership patterns, the use patterns are different from the other. Where do we go there? What is the answer?
Theo, do I have an answer for that? Man, Maybe one has to start by saying that if you look at European civilizations, at some point in the past, they had a classical similar structure than where we are at in Africa. But they have moved away from those kind of cultures. You know, I mean, they had either captains, chiefs, or whatever. They had unilateral land allocation, similar patterns that we see here currently happening in Africa, in most of Africa. And perhaps our own question should be, why did they move away? And by moving away, is that the reason why they are prosperous compared to where we are as Africa? And perhaps if we can find an answer between those lines, maybe we can take a leaf from that and see what is it that we can apply in our own situation to actually go forward. The traditional land structure in South Africa in itself, even among the Africans, is so skewed that not everybody is happy. We don't need external people to tell us that. You know, some traditional authorities are treated more superior than others. Some have got full rights of allocating land to their subjects. Some don't have. So I think it's a whole. We need maybe a whole indaba on traditional land allocation.
That's why I called it a hot potato, because it's politically very, very difficult ground to move on. Moving into the future, because that's where we're heading. If you look at the positive side, what would you say are the things that, if we do it right, will change the way the future unfolds? Because the future typically doesn't unfold in one direction. It unfolds in several directions. I will get to him later on the Zimbabwe scenario. I would like to give you the high road.
Okay. No, so first of all, people do not understand the unseen of agriculture. Okay, so you have the seen and the unseen. So we've got a farm next to the Orange River where it's roughly 1,700 hectares under irrigation. People only see that every 100 hectares got one laborer on it. They would say, how do you create so little jobs on so huge capital deployment? So, but what the people do not see is the pumps at the station, or the water pump station that needs to be serviced, the bearings on the pump station, the pipes that needs to be fixed, the electrician that comes in. We bring in, we produce about 30,000 tons of grain a year at this farm, divided by 30. But people do not see the fertilizer coming in. People do not see the clearing agent that is bringing in the fertilizer. People do not see the bank, the insurance. So that this one job is actually creating 30 jobs around it. Take away this one farm, you will lose at least, according to me, 140 to 500 jobs, depends on. You don't see the co-op that is sitting there in the town. In our town, there's 2 co-ops that compete on this. And the mechanic that fixes the tractor. And I can go on. The guy that brings the diesel, Sassel, that you create jobs. So please understand, if we want to kick this table's leg off, let's do it. But know that the table is going to fall. So we, and well, is that positive? Is that the high road? Yes. The high road is, Chris, if we produce another 1 million hectares worth of grain in the Eastern Cape, our animal feed industry will grow at least with another 500,000 tons a year, and we will actually be able to grow chickens on a constant export parity basis. And we would not have to worry about brown meat coming in from Europe, and we don't need to worry about tariffs. So a surplus grain might create a problem on markets, but at the end of the day, the high road would be unbelievable, because Transkei is God's own country. I mean, you can put their avocados in there, like from here, from Umtata right through to Butterworth, and it would grow. So, I mean, the high road in this country is unbelievable. Just make the right decision. Let's not go backwards. Let's learn from history. Yeah, so I'm so excited about this continent. I want to, shout. And
no, that's what I was looking for. But For you, I've got a special request, and that is share with us, since we're a nation in conversation. South Africans are talking about the future. Our parliamentary committees must provide some guidance by the end of August, which is not far from here. Apparently, they've got 140,000 submissions to work through. Now, I know a few parliamentarians, I can't see them working through that until the end of August. What lessons do we take from Zimbabwe? What is it that we shouldn't do?
Well, let me share what you should do. If I have time, I'll come to what you shouldn't do.
Okay.
If we focus on land and agricultural development, you have to make your decisions quickly about what you do with the land. If you're going to do land reform, do it quickly. Don't wait 20 years like we did, because then the initiative passes from you to other people, and you can't determine the direction and the pace it will go. So do it in good time. Don't spend time arguing about is it going to be with or without compensation. Take a decision and move forward with it, firstly. Secondly, you need courage. There is a lot of vested interest around land. And so at one point, you need to take a determination that this is the direction we are going to go and pull everybody behind you. Thirdly, when you make the decision, please go ahead and implement it. Our experience in Zim is it took us more than 15 years to decide that we were going to acquire land. When we acquired the land, it took us another 7 years to decide what we were going to do with it. In the process, we moved from being the breadbasket of the region to being the basket case of the region. People who could feed themselves are now dependent on food imports. So there isn't time to waste in making the decisions that we have to make. The lessons of what not to do is to be moved by emotion and sentiment. Be rational, be sober, be deliberate and purposeful about what you want to do. If you say the economy is the land and the land is the economy, and it's a slogan for campaigning on, but it's not reflecting on what you do on the ground, you will not get anywhere. A very short footnote about title. Between 1982 and 1996, the communal farmers in Zimbabwe moved from producing 16% of commercially traded maize to 80% of commercially traded maize. They did not have title. There were things that were done: credit, expertise, extension services, and marketing infrastructure, even before they had the title. So the complete picture will require that we deal with the title. But in the transition, we can achieve some things substantially before we get the title. Or until we get the title.
Okay, why did they then not producing after the title deed was taken away? Why didn't they keep on producing 80% of the grain?
The title deed was taken away from the commercial farmer, not from the communal farmer.
Now they're not producing 80%. Why?
There's a big discussion around the destruction of the system of expertise. The extension worker, who was the backbone of the recovery of the communal agriculture in Zimbabwe, was destroyed. Reasons I can share. The marketing infrastructure was destroyed, and the financing. You have a land bank here. We had a body we called the Agricultural Finance Corporation, which lent to the communal areas without title deeds, without immovable property. The repayment rate was 96% every year. There was no default.
And that was even destroyed in this process. Chris, the one scenario that Southern Africa has huge potential. The other one is that, watch out, don't destroy this thing, because building it up will take a lot of time. This muddling through road, are we more like in a muddling through process rather than the high road or the low road? Where do you see us going?
I think we muddle along, to be quite honest. Look, I do think we're making progress. Theo, we need to recognize that there's a new process, there's a new regime, there's new opportunities, there's an excitement about the regime. I don't think that in a year's time we will get to a point, I'm certain that we will get to a point where we understand what the government's approach is going to be on land reform. I hope, answering the question that you posed earlier, I hope that we get to a point that we don't think that taking away from one and giving to another is growth, because that's not growth. In certain, for that person receiving, yes, that's going to be growth, but it's going to be short term. The intention would be, if we want to grow as a nation, you need to protect what you have and you need to add on to that. That's real growth. And in adding on to that, you need to create that skills and infrastructure. So if we talk about policy creation, we need to ensure that we get to a point that we can be comfortable in terms of the food production we have can be protected. Then we certainly need to also realize that we're not going to move forward if we don't get the small farmer and the small-scale farmer into production. So a lot of work needs to be done on those institutions that you refer to in terms of the land bank, in terms of development, to upskill those farmers so that we can get to a point that we multiply and increase farmer base. We come from 147,000 commercial farmers to 37,000 or 30,000. So you need to start to increase that and turn around that almost decreasing process over the last 20 years to increasing farmers again. I don't think that we can say to ourselves, just relying on small-scale farmers without title deed for food production is going to be realistic. You know, it's not realistic. We see that across Africa. Where you rely on small-scale farmers to produce for food security, doesn't happen. So you need a combination of good, strong commercial farmers. Whichever way we can protect it, we need to do that, and we need to have government in that process. And we need to understand what land ownership is in that process. And then secondly, we need to make sure that we create the next commercial farmer of 100 years from now. And that you can only do with good and well-positioned policies.
Can I ask you a fourth kind of scenario environment, broadly speaking? We've got good news, we've got bad news, we've got muddling through, but there's a fourth one, and that is a guided kind of process. If we look at Museveni in Uganda, it's got the trimmings of democracy, it's got the trimmings of this and that, but it's actually a very strongly guided kind of society. Is there something in there for us in where we're going that we take? Clem Santa once wrote a book, Pretoria Will Provide, and Other Myths. Is there such a way?
Let me try by just alluding to two facts, to two issues. The one is on, I think whatever we are discussing here is underscoring the fact that we need some certainty. If you look at the political system in South Africa, I think from democracy 10, 15 years down the road, we continued almost as business as usual, where we continued with willing buyer, willing seller principle in our engagement, especially in the agricultural sector. And then a while back, we heard of the concept of 50% market, or whether it was a profit share or equity share in a farming operation. You are aware of that. I don't even know whether that was a policy, an official policy, or exactly. So, and while we were deliberating to try and find out, is it possible that we could say, if you have got a farming operation, you can say, I'm sitting 50% of my farm with my workforce, and this is a way to redress the imbalances of the past and also to uplift the historically disadvantaged. While we have not even yet got to terms as to the modalities of how this principle or this concept is going to work out, we now hear of expropriation without compensation. My fear when one looks at this trend is actually that we are, the politicians are actually only trying to address, it's an electioneering slogans. That's what we are seeing. When we get closer to elections, we try to throw out something there to try and get a vote. And I think that's the signal which is probably not going to filter out or filter through to action. And same to what Simba is saying here, where we say, unless we act quickly and with clear guidance as to what actions are we going to take. And I think if we miss that, then this just becomes a political gimmick. And I hope we are not going down that route, because then it creates more uncertainty, more violence on the streets, and we become an ungovernable state, basically. The second comment, I think, is on the commercial farmer themselves. And it's a challenge where I'm saying, if you look at the emerging farmer in South Africa, I think we are really lacking behind. We have done good jobs. We've done quite a good, I'm sure, there are some pockets of excellence in the way, emerging farmers have emerged and have been, assisted. But it's so loose and almost immeasurable. We don't have a centralized metric where we really measure the progress of emerging farmers from what was and what is now. If every agribusiness wants to, blow its own horn as to what I have done and how I have succeeded. But I think if we really adopt a concerted effort to really see what can we do as a collective to share the risk of the emerging farmer and actually measure the progress along the value chain.
You see, the dichotomy of the emerging farmer reminds me of the same dichotomy you've got in the building industry. Years ago, they wanted to define what is a builder and what is an emerging builder. Or the guys they call them the Bucky Brigade, doing renovations and so on. The interesting thing is, as soon as you've built your first house, you're out of the business of being an emerging builder. You're a commercial builder now. So that's the same kind of problem they had in a different sector. But we've got 5 minutes left, and I want each one of us to sum up in a minute or so your views. We've got enough time for each small 1-2 minutes summing up. Let's start with you. What would be this? We've had an hour discussion now on policy and the region and scenarios. What would be your takeaway points here?
I mean, this is not a 1 hour discussion. I mean, this type of discussions has been really ongoing for 3,000 years. This is nothing new. The one thing is, Africa needs to understand that they've got the opportunity to go and look where success has taken place. Liberty is one of it. Look at America. I mean, they had to make a decision at a stage. Are they going the route of leasehold land or title? I mean, that was a discussion in 1770 or somewhere along that lines, that they had to make the decision. Obviously, they made the right decision, and we are not making the right decision. Go and look over 1978, China decided to change the agricultural policies by giving more rights to farmers. And we know what happened in China. Definitely not the reverse. Look at Ukraine, look at Russia. Go and just read the history. We don't need to be rocket science, do we? We need to learn from history. I mean, and that is my takeaway from it. Just go and see where the people are really making it. Think on the $35 trillion that this block of people are making money out of it. What was the elements that really made it? And your point on the small-scale farmers. When you took away the title and when you took away the commercial farmer, the whole thing collapses. So what is the pillar that keeps this small-scale farmer intact? So the unseen in economy, and that is a book, Law, by Bastiat, that wrote many moons ago about what is seen and unseen. So from my point of view is, let's use our heads. Let's not play the political game. And I do think political motivation has always been something different. They don't call it economics, they call it political economics. And I mean, that is a missing point in Adam Smith's as well. It was always this two together. We can't divorce them. So know that we have to live with political motivation and own agendas and own ambitions in all of us.
Rafael, what would be your final points?
Let me leave you probably with a question. And I think it's an extension of my earlier comment. if I look at South Africa currently, and especially on beef production in the country, South Africa has a cattle population of about 13 million, depending on the last census. Of that 13 million heads of cattle, I think close to between 5 and 6 million are in the hands of the communal farmers. Currently, South Africa imports additional beef, either beef or cattle on hoof from Namibia, which fills a void of about 10% shortfall in any typical particular year. And I think it's 20% on sheep. Yet you have got about 5 million of cattle in the country that is of almost no commercial value. So technically speaking, South Africa is self-sufficient in cattle production. If you can address the emerging farmer and bring those 5 million to the point that they are commercially viable, perhaps we would have less toy. We may not necessarily need land title except additional contribution, real contribution to GDP from that sector.
Good point. Chris, your parting points?
I think that looking at the past 20 years, Theo, a lot of mistakes were made, and government is the first one, or not the first one, but they start to realize that there are failures in land reform over the last 20 years. I would like to see that we, not as a result of those failures, we're putting new policies in place that's going to fail as well, because we don't have time for another failure. And hopefully we're at that point in time that we can create the proper net around this actually wonderful resource that we have in the country, and wonderful farmers and skills that we have in this country, so that we can actually use agriculture as a huge driving force around the economy in future, and around upliftment of communities. I think that's the opportunity. Unfortunately, we need to rely on government to get that policy right.
And Siba, you've got the privilege of the final word before I say goodbye.
Yeah, let's just share another experience from Zimbabwe. The tobacco production industry collapsed after land acquisition. At peak, we produced 220 million kgs. We fell down to 45 million kgs. It's recovering now on the back of between 80 and 100,000 small-scale farmers who grow 1 or 2 hectares. They don't have title yet. I'm not thrashing title. I'm saying there are things we can do that would help us form part of the steps of the ladder to the summit. Support, extension, marketing, financial financial resources. These 2 examples of maize in the early years of independence and tobacco in the last 10 years tell us that if we can create the right policy environment, if we can create certainty, we can uplift people and we can grow the economy. Tobacco is now back as the single largest foreign currency earner after mining in Zimbabwe, when it fell to 45 million kgs because of the support to the small-scale farmer. This dead capital in the communal areas, I would say keeping it that way is a crime for our country.
Absolutely. Sorry, can I just say something there? If you just give the people the title, you don't have to do all this extension stuff. It will start by itself. The flame will get by itself. Much easier.
Russell, thank you for that. With this, I must thank my panel. I had today Simba sitting next to me. Your contributions, very valuable. Chris, your contributions. Same with you, Rafael, and Russell, yours as well. And what I heard today was that we should be forward-thinking, we should be creative, we should continue the discussion, and we should look at opportunities. And in that, I think there is a very strong future for South Africa to work things out and to get cool heads over mad heads. That's really what we need. And with that, I thank you very much for participating in this program.